The examination was supposed to end the guessing. An independent pathologist, board certified in forensic medicine, a former chief medical examiner for the District of Columbia, was given the body of an 18-year-old who went into the Gulf of Mexico on the 4th of July and did not come out alive. He took that body apart, layer by layer, looking for the thing everyone was waiting for an answer. And what he produced instead were two findings nobody anticipated, and a conclusion that settled almost nothing. A mark on the back of Nolan Wells's head that no one can explain. A body that arrived in Washington, D.C., missing part of its own throat, and a cause of death that, after all of it, still reads undetermined. Before we go any further, there are things in this report that most of the coverage has gotten wrong in both directions. There are findings that have been inflated into proof of violence they do not support, and there are limitations that have been brushed past as though they do not matter when, in fact, they are the entire story. We are going to walk through every word of this document, what it actually says, what outside forensic experts say those findings can and cannot mean, and what the family, the investigators, and the state of Mississippi have each done and said since Nolan's body was pulled from the water. There is also a moment in this report, a single sentence that is the strongest thing in it for the family's position, and it has barely been discussed. We will get there. And one thing needs to be said plainly before any of this begins. This is a story about a real young man, an 18-year-old who played wide receiver and was somebody's entire world. It is also a story that now involves forensic dissections, tissue measurements, and the clinical language of decomposition. That collision between the ordinary life of a teenager and the cold vocabulary of a morgue is difficult to sit with. It should be. If at any point this feels clinical, remember the person underneath the science. His name was Nolan Xavier Wells. Now, the room where this report was read aloud, because the setting shaped how the country received it. On the morning of July 22nd, at McCormick Place in Chicago, the 117th NAACP National Convention was underway. In a room filled past capacity, Attorney Ben Crump stood at a podium with the pages of a forensic report in front of him, a set of anatomical diagrams propped on an easel beside him, and Nolan's parents, Christine and Elmore Wansley, seated a few feet away. Before he began, Crump asked them if they wanted to sit down. He warned the room that what followed would be difficult to hear. Then he acknowledged the person who had made the examination possible at all, Colin Kaepernick, whose organization covered the cost of flying Nolan's body to Washington and paying for a second autopsy the family could not have afforded on their own. To understand why that flight happened in the first place, you have to understand the mood in that room, and the mood traces back to a single hour on July 6th. The state of Mississippi had already examined Nolan's body. The Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office performed its autopsy on July 7th, one day after a park ranger found Nolan in the water off Horn Island. That report has never been released. As of this recording, it is still sitting incomplete while toxicology testing runs a process the Jackson County coroner Bruce Lynn Jr. has confirmed is not finished. So Nolan's parents were being asked to wait, indefinitely, for an answer about how their son died from a system they had stopped trusting within the first hour of his body being recovered. Rather than wait, they sent him 1,000 miles north and paid a second pathologist to look for himself. The pathologist they hired was Dr. Roger A. Mitchell, Jr., board certified in forensic pathology, president of the National Medical Association, and the former chief medical examiner for the District of Columbia. He performed his examination on July 10th, 6 days after Nolan's body was recovered and 3 days after the state had already conducted its own autopsy. He signed his preliminary report on the 19th. It was made public on the 22nd. And here is a distinction that matters more than almost anything else about this case, because it governs how every finding reached the public. Dr. Mitchell was not in that room in Chicago. He did not speak. He did not take questions. He has not given interviews about his findings. What the country received was his written preliminary report, read aloud, page by page, by the family's attorney. That is not a criticism of Crump, it is how this process works. But a lawyer's job is advocacy, not pathology. And almost everything the country now believes about this autopsy passed through an advocate's voice before it reached anyone's ears. Keep that frame visible as we go through the actual document. Start with what the report is and what it is not, because its basic architecture is not what most headlines suggested. This was a preliminary report, not a final one. In the identifying section, the decedent is listed as Nolan Xavier Wells, age 18, male. The date of death is listed as unknown. That single-line date of death, unknown, deserves a pause. It is not a clerical oversight. It means that from the body alone, no one can say with certainty when Nolan Wells died. Not the hour, not the day. Somewhere between the afternoon of the 4th of July and the morning of the 6th, and the science cannot narrow it further. It is also worth tracking the journey the body itself took because every leg of it cost information. Nolan entered the water at some point on the 4th of July. A park ranger found him on the morning of the 6th. The Jackson County coroner, Bruce Lynn Jr., confirmed his identity through dental records, an ordinary step, but one that tells you something about the condition of the remains. On the 7th, the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office performed the first autopsy, removing and dissecting the organs and retaining the neck structures. The body was then released to the family, flown to Washington, and on the 10th of July, examined a second time, 6 days from recovery to Mitchell's table. In July, after 2 days in the Gulf, decomposition does not pause for grief or for travel. Now the section that produced every headline in the country. Mitchell did what a second pathologist is supposed to do. He went looking for what the first examination might have missed, and he went looking specifically for signs of violence. The report lists the additional dissections he performed, procedures not carried out during the first autopsy. Facial dissection, posterior head and neck dissection, dissection of the ribs and pelvis, dissection of the subcutaneous and deep soft tissues, dissection of the back, the buttocks, the arms, and the legs. In plain terms, he took the body apart layer by layer, looking underneath the skin for the marks that blunt force leaves behind, even when the surface looks clean. And across all of that work, here is what he found. No fractures, no deep tissue injuries, no lacerations. Say that clearly, because it cuts against how this report has been presented in many corners. The second autopsy did not find a broken bone, a stab wound, a bullet, a strangulation mark, or any deep tissue trauma anywhere on Nolan Wells's body. Crump himself acknowledged as much at the podium. The examination turned up no evidence of wrongdoing. With one exception, and the exception is the reason we are here. During the layered posterior neck dissection, the procedure where Mitchell opened the back of the head and neck in stages, he found an area of red discoloration in the deep, soft tissue overlying the occipital bone. The occipital bone is the base of the skull at the back of the head, the part that would strike the ground if you fell backward. Fox 32 Chicago, reporting the dimensions given at the press conference, described the area as measuring 12 by 8 inches. Crump, describing the moment he was shown the photographs, said you could not help but notice it. Now, here is where careful listening matters more than anywhere else in this case, because the report itself immediately limits what that finding means. Mitchell wrote that the etiology of this finding, the cause of it, is unclear. He noted there were no lacerations of the overlying skin. He noted there were no fractures of the underlying skull. And then he wrote a sentence that almost nobody has quoted in full. These findings are inconclusive for perimortem injury due to both the extensive decomposition and the absence of associated injuries. Perimortem means at or around the time of death. So the pathologist is saying, in his own words, that he cannot conclude this mark was an injury sustained around the time Nolan died. Not that it was not. That he cannot conclude it was. But he did not dismiss it either. And that is equally important. He wrote that the finding is significant enough to be highlighted in the preliminary report for further investigation. And then he added a detail that carries real weight. This finding could not have been observed during the first autopsy because the posterior head and neck dissection was not performed there. Read that again slowly, because it is the single strongest sentence in the entire report for the family's position. Whatever that red area turns out to be, decomposition or impact, the state of Mississippi's examination never looked at it. Not because anyone concealed it, because that particular dissection is not routine and the state pathologist did not perform it. Which means that if Nolan Wells suffered a blow to the back of the head, the state's autopsy would not necessarily have seen the evidence of it. That is the finding. So what does it actually mean? For that, you need someone with no stake in this case at all. CNN put the question to Dr. Kendall Von Crowns, the chief medical examiner in Tarrant County, Texas, a working forensic pathologist with no connection to Nolan Wells, his family, or Mississippi. His answer laid out both possibilities without choosing between them. The red discoloration, he said, could represent decompositional changes of the musculature, or it could be from blunt force injury to the back of the head and neck. Both possibilities, sitting side by side, from an outside expert, with nothing to gain from either answer. Understand what decomposition means in this context, because it is the explanation nobody wants to sit with, and it is entirely real. After death, blood settles and vessels break down, tissue discolors on its own, without anyone laying a hand on the body. In a body recovered from warm Gulf water after roughly 2 days, then examined once, then transported across the country and examined again 6 days after recovery, discoloration in deep tissue is exactly the kind of artifact that can appear for reasons having nothing whatsoever to do with violence. And now hold the other half with equal honesty. Blunt force trauma to the back of the head also produces deep tissue discoloration, sometimes with no broken skin and no skull fracture at all. A hard fall backward onto a boat deck or a piece of driftwood would do it. So would being struck, so would striking your head on something in the water. The finding is consistent with an impact. It is also consistent with a body simply breaking down. That is not a dodge. That is the actual state of the evidence. And any source telling you this autopsy proved a head injury is telling you something the pathologist explicitly refused to say. There is something bleak about a young man's body being discussed this way. Dissections, discoloration, measurements by strangers who never knew him. He was 18. He played wide receiver. He was somebody's whole world. Now the second discovery, and the one that raised the most eyebrows in that room in Chicago. When Nolan Wells's body arrived in Washington, D.C., part of his throat was not with it. The report is specific about what was missing: the anterior internal neck structures. In anatomical terms, that means the trachea, the windpipe along with the laryngeal cartilage, the thyroid horn, and the hyoid bone. Mitchell recorded them as absent, not received with the body. That detail drew audible reactions in the room, and it is easy to understand why. Stated plainly, the family sent their son to a second pathologist and the parts of his neck were not in him. But the report immediately does something that the viral clips left out. It explains the likely reason, and the explanation is not sinister. Mitchell wrote that it is assumed the initial pathologist retained these structures for additional evaluation. And then, in his own report, he wrote this: the retention of the anterior neck structures during an initial autopsy is a common forensic pathology practice. That is the independent pathologist, hired by the family, telling you that what Mississippi did here is normal. Crump reinforced the same point from the podium, explaining that Mitchell himself did exactly this during his 7 years as chief medical examiner in Washington. If there was any concern about the throat, about a fracture or compression of the neck, he too would hold those structures back for closer study. ABC News confirmed the same thing with outside doctors. It is not uncommon for pathologists to remove an organ or tissue in order to examine deeper inside the body. So why does it matter at all? Because of what those structures are. The anterior neck holds the evidence of strangulation and neck compression. The hyoid bone in particular is a small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat, and forensic pathologists examine it closely in any death where pressure to the neck is a question, because it can fracture under force. If you want to know whether a person was choked, throttled, or had their airway compressed, those structures are where you look. They are, in effect, the file cabinet where that specific answer is kept. Mitchell did not have them, and so he wrote the line that has driven the last several days of coverage. A posterior neck dissection performed without review of the anterior neck structures is incomplete. Therefore, this pathologist cannot rule out injury to the neck as a contributor or cause of death. Hear the precision in that sentence. He is not saying there was an injury to the neck. He is saying he was not given the material that would let him say there was not. And Crump's ask, the practical demand that grew out of it, was the most reasonable request of the entire press conference. He is not accusing Mississippi of hiding anything. He said plainly that Mitchell does not know why they held the throat back. What he asked is that the state's medical examiner allow Mitchell to review those retained structures and to see the state's photographs and observations of Nolan's body from when it was closer in time to the 4th of July. And when this case reaches the grand jury, Crump asked, put Dr. Mitchell in front of it. That is not a demand for a verdict. It is a request for access. One pathologist asking to see what another pathologist already has. Which brings us to the deeper truth underneath this entire report, the one that has nothing to do with anyone's conduct and everything to do with sequence. A second autopsy is always a weaker instrument than the first one. Always. Dr. Priya Banerjee, a board-certified forensic pathologist speaking to NBC News with no involvement in this case, put it simply, second autopsies carry an inherent limitation because of what a body has already been through during the initial examination. It is never going to be intact or in the pristine state that you get with an unexamined body. Look at what that meant in practice here. During the state's autopsy, Nolan's organs were removed and dissected, which is what an autopsy is. Afterward, as is standard, they were returned to the body cavity so that a second pathologist could examine them if needed. But dissected organs cannot be read the way intact ones can, and that produced what Mitchell himself called the most significant limitation he faced. He could not directly observe the airway and the lungs for water, and he could not directly observe the stomach for its contents. Sit with the weight of that. In a suspected drowning, water in the airway and the lungs is close to the central question. It is one of the primary indicators pathologists use to determine whether a person was alive and breathing when they went into the water. Mitchell could not look at it. The only person who could was the state pathologist in Mississippi on July 7th. And that report has not been released. Then add decomposition. The report records marked decompositional changes in the body, and Mitchell explained the consequence directly. Decomposition can obscure the presence or absence of bruising on the skin surface, especially during a second autopsy examination, meaning that even if there had been visible bruises on Nolan Wells when he came out of that water, by July 10th they might no longer be readable. And Banerjee, the outside expert, added one more piece of context that cuts against the conspiracy framing. It is not unusual, she told NBC, for a secondary examiner to have no access to the findings of the primary examination at all because laws limit what can be publicly released. The wall between Mitchell and the Mississippi file is not necessarily anyone's stonewalling. In many cases, it is simply how the law works. So put the whole picture together honestly. The pathologist the family hired was working with a decomposed body, dissected organs, no lungs to read for water, no stomach contents to time a last meal, no neck structures to check for compression, and no toxicology results. He was through no fault of his own, examining the least informative version of the evidence that has ever existed in this case. He said so himself. He identified several limitations that create barriers to establishing a definitive cause and manner of death for Nolan Xavier Wells. That is the report's own framing of itself, in its own opening line of discussion, not a finding of foul play, a statement that the body, at this stage, cannot deliver the answer. Which is exactly why he ended the report not with a conclusion, but with a list. Before the list, Mitchell laid out a principle that governs every death like this one, and it reframes the entire investigation. In cases where a death occurs in or around a body of water with suspicion of drowning, he wrote, it is important to confirm how that person entered the water. And he added a qualifier that lands hard in this particular case. This information is especially important for the deaths of persons who can swim. Nolan Wells could swim. His family has said so from the beginning. Crump has repeated it at every appearance. He was an athlete, a college wide receiver, and by every account comfortable in the water. So the pathologist asked the questions that follow from that. Was Nolan conscious or unconscious when he entered the water? He does not know. Was he forced into the water, or did he enter it unforced? He does not know. And he wrote that definitive circumstances of death are required to determine the manner of death. That principle deserves unpacking, because it explains the entire report better than any headline has. Drowning is one of the hardest determinations in all of forensic pathology. There is no single test for it, no marker that lights up and settles the question. In most other deaths, the body carries its own explanation, a wound, a blockage, a diseased organ, a toxic level of some substance. Drowning frequently leaves none of that. What pathologists look for instead are supporting indicators. Fluid and foam in the airway, the condition and weight of the lungs, water in the stomach, signs consistent with a person actively breathing while submerged. And then they weigh those indicators against everything else known about the death. That is why drowning is often described as a diagnosis of exclusion. A pathologist rules out the other explanations, confirms the findings are consistent with submersion, and considers the circumstances in which the person entered the water. Circumstances are not a footnote in a drowning case. They are part of the diagnosis itself. Apply that to Dr. Mitchell's situation. He could not examine the airway. He could not examine the lungs for water. He could not examine the stomach contents. He had no toxicology. and he had no reliable account of how Nolan Wells came to be in that water in the first place, whether he walked in, fell in, was carried by a current, or entered some other way, and whether he was awake when it happened. Every single input the determination requires was either missing or disputed. Under those conditions, a competent pathologist does not guess. He writes undetermined. That word is not a hint about foul play, and it is not a failure of the examination. It is an accurate description of what can be concluded from what he was given. Then came the sentence that has traveled further than any other line in this case. For these reasons, this pathologist cannot rule out if any intervening non-accidental factors contributed to or caused the death of Nolan Wells. Non-accidental factors. In forensic language, that is the door left open for another person's involvement. And it is why every headline has carried some version of the phrase cannot rule out foul play. But notice the architecture of that sentence. It does not say the evidence suggests foul play. It says the pathologist cannot exclude it for these reasons, meaning the limitations he just finished listing. The inability to rule something out is a statement about the strength of the evidence available, not about the strength of the suspicion. A pathologist with a decomposed body, no lungs to examine, and no neck structures cannot rule out a great many things. That is the honest reading, and the family's honest position is that an open door is enough to demand a real investigation. Both of those can be true at once. Mitchell closed his preliminary report with 7 outstanding questions, the things he says must be answered before anyone can call this case understood. They are worth hearing, because they are effectively the investigative to-do list now sitting in front of Mississippi authorities. What were the circumstances that led to Nolan Xavier Wells entering the water? What was the position of the body when it was found? Crump noted at the podium that a member of the United Cajun Navy, one of the volunteer groups involved in the search, has said Nolan was found face down and fully clothed. Was there water in the airway? Is there any evidence of injuries to the anterior neck structures, the ones Mitchell never received? Is there any evidence of intracranial hemorrhaging, bleeding inside the skull? Note how directly that connects to the red discoloration at the back of the head. The state pathologist, examining the brain on July 7th, could have answered it. Mitchell, receiving the body after the brain had been removed, could not. What was the composition of the stomach contents, the timing question? Because stomach contents help establish how long it had been since a person's last meal, which in turn helps place the hour of death. And finally, what are the toxicology report findings? His conclusion: the best classification for the cause and manner of death of Nolan Xavier Wells is undetermined, pending investigation. And a final procedural note that this forensic pathologist reserves the right to review and incorporate additional forensic pathology information into his opinion as it becomes available. The above opinions, he wrote, are expressed to a reasonable degree of medical certainty. Signed, Dr. Roger A. Mitchell, Jr., July 19, 2026. Look closely at those 7 questions and something becomes clear. 6 of the 7 can only be answered by the state of Mississippi: the airway, the brain, the neck structures, the stomach contents, the toxicology, the condition of the body when it was first recovered. Every one of those answers exists in a file in Mississippi, held by the state medical examiner, unreleased. That is why Crump spent so much of that press conference asking for access rather than accusing anyone of a crime. His stated ask was narrow. Let Mitchell see the photographs. Let him see the observations of Nolan's body from closer in time to the 4th of July. And when this case reaches the grand jury, put Dr. Mitchell in front of it. So where do the authorities stand? Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter has said there was no initial indication of a crime, but he has paired that with something else at every opportunity that his investigators are working diligently to determine exactly what occurred. Speaking to ABC News, he said Nolan Wells's family deserves a thorough and factual investigation, and that is exactly what they are going to get. And here is the detail that almost never makes it into coverage of this case. The sheriff's office has said it welcomes the family's independent investigation. Not resisted it, welcomed it. That is not the posture of an agency trying to bury something, and honest reporting has to say so. The scale of the work has grown, too. According to Mississippi's Sun-Herald, the sheriff's department has now interviewed dozens of witnesses and is working with the FBI on the case. The Jackson County District Attorney has told the same outlet that the case is a priority and confirmed she will forward the results of the law enforcement investigation to a grand jury to decide whether any charges are warranted. The Jackson County coroner, Bruce Lynn Jr., has confirmed the state's autopsy report is not yet finished, and that once it is complete, it will be provided to his office. He also offered CNN a piece of context that deserves to sit alongside everything else in this story. Over the years, his office has received numerous drowning victims from Mississippi's barrier islands. The currents near Horn Island can be notoriously rough. The island has no shelters, no restrooms, and no communications. People go into that water, and sometimes they do not come out. None of that proves how Nolan Wells died, but it is the reason a drowning finding, if it eventually comes, would not be some improbable conclusion invented to close a case. It would be the most statistically ordinary outcome on that stretch of coast. Now, the other side of that ledger, because the family's distrust did not appear out of nowhere. Christine Wansley told The Room in Chicago how much contact she has had with the agency investigating her son's death. The last time she actually spoke with the sheriff's department, by her account, was a day or two after Nolan's body was found, and she was the one who initiated it, sending a text message. "This is Christine, Nolan's mom. I just want to see if there are any updates." He called back. "There were no updates. We are still interviewing." That was roughly 2 weeks before she stood at that podium. But the root of it, for both parents, goes back to a single moment on July 6th. By Christine's account, Nolan's body had not been removed from the scene for even an hour before the sheriff publicly characterized the death as an accidental drowning with no foul play suspected. Before any autopsy, before toxicology, before the interviews that are still going on now, she had asked investigators to treat the case as though Nolan were their own child, and they had promised her they would. Then that statement went out. Everything the family has done since the independent autopsy, the national attorney, the press conferences traces back to that hour. The family met with the district attorney, who promised transparency going forward. Christine's answer to that was blunt. The damage has already been done, because that early conclusion is now the narrative the general public carries. She also laid out the details that do not sit right with her. 300 to 400 people were on Horn Island that day. You mean to tell me nobody saw anything? And the detail she keeps returning to, the one no explanation has satisfied. An 18-year-old choosing to stay behind on an island does not send his phone home on the boat. He does not send his car keys home either. If he had planned to stay, she says, he would have said, "Give me my phone, give me my keys." It is not adding up. Underneath all of it sits the conflict this case has never resolved. A young woman who says Nolan told her he was getting back on the boat with his friends, and the friends who say he told them he was staying behind to talk with her. The sheriff has said his investigators' interviews indicate Nolan chose to stay, believing he would get a ride back with someone else, and that the friends have cooperated with the investigation. Two accounts still standing in opposition, still unresolved by anyone with the authority to resolve them. And there is a dimension of this case that cannot be reported around, because it is a documented fact, and because the family has placed it at the center of their own argument. Nolan Wells was the only black person in the group that traveled to Horn Island that day. The rest of the group was white. Video from the island showed a largely white crowd. The Associated Press has reported that the family's distrust has been deepened by the state's long legacy of racism. The NAACP, at whose national convention these findings were released, has adopted a resolution calling on local, state, and federal authorities, including the United States Department of Justice, to conduct a thorough and transparent investigation into Nolan's death. Crump made the racial argument explicitly in Chicago, invoking Emmett Till and Medgar Evers, and posing a hypothetical directly to The Room. If the roles had been reversed, would the investigation have looked the same? Whether you find that argument persuasive is your call. What is not in dispute is that it is the argument the family is making in public, and it is now part of the record of this case. There is also a practical consequence to an undetermined ruling that is worth understanding before that grand jury ever convenes. A criminal case involving a death generally requires establishing how the death happened. A prosecutor has to be able to tell a jury what killed the person and connect someone's conduct to it. An undetermined cause of death does not make that impossible, but it makes it substantially harder, and it puts enormous weight on everything outside the autopsy, the timeline, the witness accounts, the digital evidence, the physical scene. If the medical evidence stays undetermined, the circumstances become the case. And right now, the circumstances are exactly what remain in dispute. So here is where everything actually stands, as of this recording. The independent autopsy is complete and preliminary undetermined, pending investigation, with 7 open questions and a pathologist who has reserved the right to revise his opinion as more information arrives. The state's autopsy is done but unreleased, still waiting on toxicology. The sheriff's investigation continues, with dozens of witnesses interviewed and the FBI assisting. The district attorney is committed to sending the completed file to a grand jury. Crump has asked that Dr. Mitchell be permitted to review Mississippi's photographs and retain neck structures, and that he be called to testify before that grand jury. No one has been charged, no one has been publicly named a suspect, and the cause of Nolan Wells's death remains, officially and independently, unknown. Everyone expected the second autopsy to settle something. It settled almost nothing about the body, but it settled a great deal about where the answer now has to come from. Mitchell examined Nolan Wells as thoroughly as a second pathologist can, took him apart layer by layer looking for violence, and found no fractures, no deep tissue injuries, no lacerations. One unexplained area of discoloration that may be trauma or maybe decomposition, and a set of doors he could not open because the material was in another state. What that means is that the body, at this point, has said what it can say. The rest of this case does not live in a morgue. It lives in the circumstances the 90 minutes between the last confirmed sighting of Nolan and the moment the boat left without him, the phone that went home while he did not, the 2 irreconcilable accounts of what he said he was going to do, 300 to 400 people on that island, and so far, no public account of what any of them saw after 3 in the afternoon. Mitchell said it in his own way, and it is the most important line in his report. Definitive circumstances of death are required to determine the manner of death. He is telling investigators, in writing, that the pathology has gone as far as it can. Everything else is on them. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, a graduate of Ocean Springs High School, a rising sophomore wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, days from reporting back for his season. On July 21st, hundreds of people filled a church in Ocean Springs to bury him. The next morning, his mother sat in a room in Chicago and listened to a stranger read her son's autopsy out loud. She has said what she wants, over and over, and it has never changed. Not a verdict, not a conviction. Just this, that someone treat her son's case as if he were their own child. When the toxicology lands, when the state's report is released, when that grand jury acts, the breakdown will be here, and nothing before it is confirmed. Of all the unanswered questions in this case, which one do you think matters most? Put it in the comments, because the questions people are asking are part of how this story gets told going forward. If this is the kind of reporting you want on cases like this, careful, sourced, and not willing to trade accuracy for clicks, subscribe, and turn on notifications so the next update reaches you the moment it is ready.